A fire burst in the nursery, and the black maid rushed in first while the Mafia boss arrived seconds too late. It was a quiet evening in the luxurious estate of Mafia boss Dominic Vitti, a man whose wealth and power were unmatched. The mansion stood tall and imposing, surrounded by towering gates and high security. Inside, life seemed perfect: polished floors, elegant furniture, and pristine rooms. But in the nursery, the unthinkable was about to happen. A sudden burst of fire erupted from the corner of the room, flames leaping to the ceiling in an instant. The air grew thick with smoke, and the baby's cries echoed through the house. Maria Jenkins, the black maid who had been tending to the child just moments earlier, heard the explosion. Without hesitation, she rushed toward the nursery, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. She knew that time was running out, that every second counted. She burst through the door, the heat from the flames immediately hitting her, but she didn't hesitate. She could see the baby, helpless and crying, lying in the crib surrounded by the rising smoke. Maria's body moved on pure instinct as she reached the crib, lifting the baby into her arms, and began moving toward the door, her mind focused solely on getting him out of harm's way. The flames licked at her skin as she carefully maneuvered through the burning room, her every step guided by the desperate need to save the child. Meanwhile, outside the nursery, the sound of approaching footsteps signaled that someone else was coming. It was Dominic Vitti, the Mafia boss, rushing to the scene after hearing the alarm. But by the time he reached the door, Maria was already making her way out of the nursery. The smoke was thick, and Dominic could barely see through it. Panic filled his chest as he pushed through the haze, only to see Maria emerge from the flames, the baby safely in her arms. He froze for a moment, realizing just how close they had come to losing the child. Maria's face was covered in soot, her clothes singed, but she didn't falter. Her eyes met Dominic's for the briefest moment, and in that moment, she saw something in his gaze that she had never expected: gratitude. Dominic didn't speak at first, only standing there, watching her. His usual cold and detached demeanor was nowhere to be found. Instead, he stood in shock, as if the realization of what had just happened had hit him all at once. The powerful, ruthless Mafia boss, whose every command was obeyed without question, now found himself indebted to a woman he had once viewed as nothing more than a servant. Maria, on the other hand, didn't wait for his words. She had done what needed to be done, and now that the child was safe, her duty was over. She handed him to one of the security guards who had rushed to the scene and began to step back. But Dominic stepped forward, his voice finally breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" His words were soft, unlike anything Maria had ever heard from him. Maria's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. She had saved his son, but in doing so, she had unknowingly begun to change their relationship. Her actions had shown him something he had never noticed before: her strength, her courage, and her humanity. But it wasn't just about the rescue. It was about what followed. A simple question, a simple acknowledgement. Maria could feel her heart swelling as she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine, sir." It was a new beginning, one that neither of them expected, but one that would forever change the dynamic between them. Dominic had seen her as nothing more than a maid, a part of the background of his luxurious life. But now, as he looked at her, he realized she was something more, someone who had risked everything to save his son. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it was significant. The fire in the nursery had burned away more than just the flames. It had burned away the walls between them. Maria stood outside the nursery, her hands still trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. The smoke had cleared, and the sounds of chaos faded, leaving only the stillness of the moment. She had saved the baby. She had done what she thought was impossible, but it was done now. The child was safe, and that was all that mattered. She exhaled slowly, her chest tight, trying to calm her racing heart. But even as she tried to collect herself, she couldn't shake the look on Dominic Vitti's face. He had watched her, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, or at least, not the kind she expected. It was something else, something that made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, as if the tension in the air still lingered. She had been so focused on the baby, on the flames, on getting him out of there, that she hadn't thought about what would come after. She hadn't thought about how Dominic would react. She hadn't thought about how he might see her differently. But now, as she stood there in the hallway, still covered in soot, still trying to catch her breath, she wondered what would happen next. Would he treat her as just another servant again? Or would something change between them? Dominic walked up to her, his footsteps slow but deliberate, his presence overwhelming. He was a man used to commanding attention, to being obeyed without question. But now, there was something different about him. His usual cold demeanor had softened, just slightly, but enough to make Maria feel a shift in the air. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze never leaving her. His jaw clenched as if he were struggling with something he wasn't used to. "You saved him," he said, his voice low and steady. Maria didn't know how to respond. She had only done what anyone in her position would have done. It wasn't bravery, it was instinct. She had to save the child. She had no other choice. But hearing him say it, hearing him acknowledge what she had done, made her feel vulnerable in a way she couldn't explain. "I just did what I had to do," she replied quietly, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Dominic studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if he were trying to figure out what to make of her. "I never thought I'd see you like this," he said, his voice tinged with a note of respect. "I didn't think you had it in you." Maria wasn't sure if she should be offended or grateful. She had always been seen as just a maid in his eyes, a part of the background of his luxurious life. She had always been invisible to him. But now, in the wake of the fire, something had changed. He was looking at her like she was more than just the help, and that thought made her uneasy. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She wasn't sure what it meant. "I just did what needed to be done," she repeated, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't want to think about what he was implying, didn't want to think about what might come of this. But Dominic's next words stopped her. "You did more than that," he said, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to her as a person, not as a servant. "You saved my son. I won't forget that." Maria felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She wasn't sure if he meant it, but the sincerity in his tone made her wonder. It made her feel like, for the first time, she wasn't invisible. For the first time, she wasn't just the maid. She was someone who had mattered. But before she could say anything, Dominic turned, his back to her as he walked toward the exit of the hallway. "Come on," he said without looking back, his tone commanding but not harsh. "Let's get you cleaned up." Maria stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. She had saved his son. That was the only thing that had mattered to her. But now, as she followed him down the hallway, she couldn't help but wonder if her life had just taken a turn that would change everything. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same between her and Dominic Vitti again. The following days passed in a blur for Maria. The mansion, which had once felt like a world unto itself, now felt different. The air seemed charged with an unspoken tension between her and Dominic. She was no longer just the maid. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the subtle shifts of his behavior. She hadn't expected things to change. She hadn't asked for it, but it was happening nonetheless. Dominic had been distant after the fire, as though he were struggling with something internal. She saw the way he sometimes watched her across the room, his eyes lingering longer than they should. She wasn't used to this attention, not from him. It made her uncomfortable, but at the same time, it felt like a strange acknowledgement that hadn't been there before. Maria spent the next few days cleaning the mansion, just like always. She moved through the grand hallways, dusting fine china and polishing the marble floors. But even as she worked, her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about Dominic's words. "You saved my son. I won't forget that." He had said it so softly, with such sincerity, that she couldn't dismiss it as just a moment of gratitude. She had seen something in his eyes when he spoke to her, a flicker of something she didn't fully understand. Maria had never been one to seek out attention. She had learned early in life to keep her head down and her voice quiet. But now, for the first time, she found herself wondering if there was more to her place in the world than just being invisible. The thought made her uneasy. She wasn't supposed to matter. She was just the maid. But here she was, questioning everything. That evening, as she finished her shift and prepared to leave, she found herself standing at the door of Dominic's study. She had no reason to be there, no reason at all. But something pulled her in. Maybe it was the uncertainty she felt, or maybe it was the need for some kind of closure. She stood for a moment outside the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She knew she shouldn't disturb him, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away. She had to know if there was more to his words than just gratitude. She took a deep breath and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was. Dominic Fozy, the Mafia boss, but not just the man who ruled with fear and power. There was something different in him now. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Come in." She stepped inside, feeling her nerves tighten in her chest. She had never been this close to him outside of work, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. He looked up from the papers on his desk, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung between them, heavy and awkward. "I wanted to thank you again," he said, breaking the silence. "What you did for my son. It means more to me than you can imagine." Maria swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't used to being thanked. She wasn't used to this kind of acknowledgement, especially not from someone like him. "I just did what needed to be done," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic nodded, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "You're a rare person, Maria," he said, his tone softening. "Most people would have run from the fire, but you didn't. You saved him." Maria shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to process his words. She had always prided herself on doing the right thing, but now, with Dominic's words hanging in the air, she felt like she was under a microscope. "It was nothing," she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together in front of her. Dominic stood from behind his desk and walked over to where she stood. He was close now, closer than he had ever been. His presence filled the room, overwhelming and magnetic. "It wasn't nothing," he said quietly, his voice lower now, almost intimate. "You're a hero, Maria. And He stopped, as if unsure of how to continue. The words seemed to get stuck in his throat. Maria looked up at him, her heart racing. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, uncertain. It was almost as if he was struggling with something inside himself. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. Dominic let out a slow breath, his expression softening. "You've done more than that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I won't forget it." There was a long pause as they stood there, neither of them speaking. Maria's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had always seen Dominic as a figure of power and control, but now, standing so close to him, she saw a different side of him. A side that was conflicted, unsure. And for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a servant in his world. She was someone who mattered. She could feel the shift between them, something unspoken passing in the silence. It was a moment of connection that neither of them had anticipated. Maria wasn't sure what it meant, but in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. Things had changed. And she wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew that whatever happened, she wasn't invisible anymore. The following days felt like a slow march to something that neither Maria nor Dominic could quite understand. The tension between them was palpable, but neither knew how to address it. Maria continued with her work, her routine unchanged on the surface, but every moment in the mansion felt different now. Her actions during the fire had changed something between them, even though neither of them spoke about it openly. Every time their paths crossed, there was an invisible line neither dared to cross, but the awareness of each other lingered. Dominic, for his part, seemed to struggle with the changes in himself. He found himself looking at Maria more often, seeing her not just as a servant, but as a person who had risked her life for his child. It was a realization that was both uncomfortable and unsettling. He had always prided himself on being in control, on maintaining a distance from those around him. But now, that distance felt impossible to uphold. It was during one of their rare conversations that things began to shift again. It happened in the library, a room filled with leather-bound books and the scent of aged paper. Maria was dusting the shelves when Dominic walked in, his usual quiet steps signaling his presence. She didn't immediately acknowledge him, lost in her task, but she could feel him there, watching her. "Maria," he said, his voice breaking the silence. She turned to face him, trying to keep her expression neutral, but her heart rate quickened. "Yes, sir?" He didn't reply immediately, instead walking toward the window and looking out over the estate. The view was breathtaking, with the rolling hills in the distance. But it wasn't the view that occupied his thoughts. It was Maria. He felt a strange tug in his chest as he watched her, as though the very air around them had changed since the fire. "You've been here for a long time," he said, his voice low, almost contemplative. Maria nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I've been here for years," she replied, her tone careful. "But things are different now, aren't they?" Dominic turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Maria didn't know how to respond to that. She wanted to tell him that nothing had changed, that she was still just the maid, just the servant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yes," she said softly. "Things are different." Dominic studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. He took a step closer, the space between them closing in a way that felt unfamiliar. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "about what you did for my son, about what you risked." Maria felt her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure what to say, but the words came out before she could stop them. "I didn't do it for you, Dominic," she said quietly. "I did it because he needed me." It was the truth, but as soon as the words left her mouth, she realized how much they revealed. She wasn't just the maid. She was a person with her own morals, her own reasons, her own choices. Dominic seemed to sense the shift in her, the subtle change in the way she spoke. He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. But this time, Maria didn't shrink back. "I know," he said softly, "but still, you've done something that no one else would have. You've proven that you're more than just a maid to me." Maria's heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure how to process it. For so long, she had lived in the background of Dominic's world, a silent observer, never questioning her place. But now, as she stood there with him, she couldn't help but feel that something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. "I'm just doing my job," she said again, but her voice lacked the conviction it once had. Dominic looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no sense of superiority. There was only an understanding, something Maria hadn't expected. "I used to think I understood everything," Dominic said quietly, "but I was wrong. I didn't understand you. I didn't understand what you were capable of." Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had never expected him to acknowledge her like this, to see her as something more than just an employee. But as she stood there, she realized that perhaps, for the first time in her life, someone was seeing her. Really seeing her. The moment stretched between them, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Maria broke the silence. "What does that mean, Dominic?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't immediately answer, his gaze lingering on her, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't say anything at all. But then, he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "It means that I'm starting to see you for who you really are," he said, his voice soft but steady. "And I think it's time I start treating you that way." Maria stood there, her heart racing, unsure of what to make of his words. She wasn't sure if she should be hopeful or afraid. All she knew was that everything was changing, and she wasn't sure what that meant for her anymore. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy silence between Maria and Dominic. Though they had spoken, though he had acknowledged her bravery, there was an unspoken tension between them that neither could ignore. Maria went about her duties in the mansion, trying to keep her thoughts on her work, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. It wasn't just the fire or the near loss of the child. It was the quiet shift in their dynamic. It was the fact that Dominic had seen her as something more than just the maid. It was the way he spoke to her now, more like an equal, more like someone who mattered. And it unsettled her. She wasn't used to being seen in that way. She had always existed in the background, never in the forefront of his mind. But now, after the fire, everything had changed. Dominic seemed to sense the distance between them, the awkwardness that hung in the air whenever their paths crossed. He could tell that Maria wasn't the same. She was quieter, more introspective. She had always been quiet, yes, but now there was a distance in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. He had tried to reach out to her, tried to make their interactions as normal as possible, but she was reserved. She had always been reserved, but now it was different. She was distant in a way that made him wonder if he had crossed some invisible line. One evening, Dominic found himself standing in the hallway, outside Maria's room. He hadn't planned to confront her. He hadn't planned to do anything at all. But the thought of the distance between them, the quiet tension, had been gnawing at him all day. He wasn't sure what to say to her, or even if he should say anything. But he couldn't ignore it anymore. Taking a deep breath, he knocked lightly on her door. There was a long pause before he heard her soft voice from inside. "Yes?" she asked, her tone neutral. Dominic hesitated for a moment before responding. "Maria, can we talk?" There was another long pause before the door slowly creaked open, and Maria stood in front of him, her expression unreadable. She had always been a woman of few words, but tonight, there was something different about her. She looked tired, worn, as though the weight of the past few days had taken its toll. "Of course," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Dominic entered the room, feeling an unfamiliar unease in his chest. The room was simple, nothing like the lavish rooms of the mansion, but it was cozy in its own way. Maria's things were neatly arranged, and the faint smell of lavender hung in the air. Dominic couldn't help but notice how different this space was from the rest of the house. It was more personal, more intimate, and it made him realize just how much he had never truly seen her before. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice softer than usual. Maria raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. "Apologize?" she asked, her voice cautious. Dominic nodded slowly. "For the way things have been between us. After the fire, I know I've been distant, and I didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable." Maria remained silent for a moment, her eyes studying him. "It's not about being uncomfortable, Dominic," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's about the way you've started looking at me. You're treating me differently." The words hung in the air, and Dominic could feel his chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much his actions had affected her. "I didn't mean to make you feel that way," he said, his voice softer. "But you saved my son, Maria. I can't ignore that. I can't just go back to how things were before." Maria looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I did it because he's just a child. He needed me." Dominic took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to say something, to explain how much it meant to him, how much she had changed something in him, but the words didn't come. For the first time, he found himself at a loss for what to say. Maria seemed to sense his struggle, and she took a small step back, her gaze softening. "I know you didn't ask for my help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I did it anyway. Because that's what I do. I help people." Dominic's heart twisted at her words. He had never truly seen her before, not like this. He had always seen her as just the maid, just someone who did the work around the house. But now, he saw her as someone who mattered, someone who had given so much of herself to save his son. He wanted to say something, anything, to make her understand how much he appreciated her, how much he respected her. But the words felt inadequate. "You're more than just a maid," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Maria looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. "I'm just a woman doing her job," she said softly, but there was a hint of something else in her voice. Dominic took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "You're so much more than that," he said quietly, "and I think you deserve to know that." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Maria could feel the weight of his gaze, the sincerity in his words, and something inside her stirred. She didn't know what it meant, what this moment meant, but for the first time, she felt like she was truly seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next few days felt like a dream to Maria, a strange mix of uncertainty and an unsettling sense of being seen. The mansion was quieter than usual, and although she went through the motions of her daily duties, there was an undeniable shift in the air. It wasn't just the way Dominic had treated her, but the way she began to feel about herself. For the first time, she wasn't just the maid, the invisible woman in the background. She was someone who had risked everything for a child, someone who mattered. As the days passed, she found herself spending more time in the nursery, checking on the baby, making sure he was comfortable and safe. It was her way of finding purpose in the midst of everything that had changed. But no matter how much she focused on her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that things between her and Dominic were far from settled. He had been distant in his own way, but the tension between them lingered. She had done what she could, but she couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. It was late one evening when Dominic finally came to her again. She had just finished cleaning the kitchen and was about to head to her room when she heard his voice. "Maria, could I speak with you?" He sounded almost hesitant, his usual confidence tempered by something else. Maria turned to face him, unsure of what to expect. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air heavy with the unspoken words between them. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice softer than usual. "About how you did it for the child, not for me." Maria nodded, unsure of what he was getting at. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did it because he was in danger. Because he's just a child." Dominic's gaze softened, and for the first time, Maria saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. It was a mixture of respect and something else, something deeper. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "But I need you to know that I don't just see you as the maid anymore, Maria." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected him to say something like that. She had never expected him to acknowledge the way things had changed between them. "I've been thinking about that too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected you to see me any differently." Dominic stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers in a gentle, tentative gesture. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a wave of warmth through her. "You're not invisible to me, Maria," he said softly. "Not anymore." Maria felt her breath catch in her throat. She had spent so long being invisible to the world around her, being nothing more than the maid in the background. But here, in this moment, with Dominic standing before her, she felt seen. She felt valued. It was a feeling that both terrified and exhilarated her. "I don't know what this means," she said, her voice shaky. "I don't know where we go from here." Dominic took her hand in both of his grip warm and reassuring. "I don't know either," he admitted. "But I do know that I want to find out. I want to see where this goes." Maria looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of uncertainty, but all she saw was sincerity. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this moment. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone who mattered. "I'm not asking for anything more," she said quietly, "but I'm willing to see where this goes too." Dominic nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for saving my son." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't the kind of conversation either of them had expected to have, but it was one that needed to be said. And for the first time, Maria felt like she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. A chapter where she was no longer invisible, no longer just the maid. She was Maria, a woman who had done something extraordinary, and she was finally beginning to see herself as more than just a servant in someone else's world. As they stood there in the hallway, the tension between them began to fade, replaced by something new, something uncertain but hopeful. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, they were willing to find out together. Days passed, and the distance that had once felt like a chasm between Maria and Dominic began to shrink, but it wasn't without its challenges. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, things were still uncertain. She had saved his son, yes, and Dominic had acknowledged her bravery, but the weight of those actions still hung heavy on her heart. There were moments when their eyes met, and she could see that the dynamic between them was changing, but it was slow, fragile. Every encounter with Dominic left her feeling both closer to him and more unsure of herself. It was an odd mix of emotions, but Maria had learned long ago to guard her heart. She didn't expect anything more than to keep doing her job, to stay in the background as she had always done. But now, when she passed Dominic in the hallways, when he gave her that soft smile or asked how her day was, there was a warmth in his voice that left her feeling confused. Was this how things would be now? Was she expected to take on a new role in his life, or was it just a fleeting moment of kindness? She didn't know what to think, but she couldn't ignore the feelings that stirred within her. One afternoon, as Maria was finishing her duties in the garden, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the other staff members, but instead, it was Dominic. His presence was commanding, yet there was something different in his approach today. He wasn't standing tall, observing from afar. He was walking toward her, his eyes focused on her with a purposeful intent. Maria's heart raced as he drew closer, her mind unsure of what he wanted. "Maria," he said, his voice steady. "Could we talk for a moment?" She nodded, her palms slightly clammy. "Of course, sir." He paused for a moment. His expression softened as he looked at her. "I've been thinking about what we spoke about the other night," he said quietly. "About how things have changed." Maria looked at him, not sure where this conversation was going. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic's gaze softened further, and for a moment, Maria saw something in him that she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. It was strange, but she could see that he was wrestling with something just as much as she was. "I don't want things to feel awkward between us," he continued, his voice sincere. "I want us to move forward, but I know it's not easy." Maria was silent, unsure of how to respond. She had never been in a situation like this, where she was standing face to face with someone who had once been a distant figure in her life. Now, that same person was standing in front of her, not just as her employer, but as someone who seemed to want more, someone who saw her as more. "I don't want to be just the maid anymore," Dominic said, his words lingering in the air. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, her mind racing to process what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft. He took a step closer to her, his presence commanding but gentle. "I mean that I've realized I've treated you like you were just someone who worked for me, but you're not just that. You're more than that." Maria's heart raced as she looked up at him, her pulse quickening. The words were so simple, but they carried so much weight. "I don't know what this means," she whispered. "I don't know where we go from here." Dominic's eyes softened as he took another step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't know either," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I do know that I want to try. I want to see where this goes. I want to see you as more than just someone who works here." Maria could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't know what to say. She had always lived her life within the boundaries of what was expected, never questioning, never stepping outside of her role. But now, as she stood here with Dominic, she felt like the walls around her were crumbling. Could she really see herself differently? Could she allow herself to believe that she was worthy of something more? "I don't know what this means either," Maria said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm willing to see where it goes." Dominic smiled, a small but genuine smile, and Maria felt something shift inside her. It was the beginning of something new, but neither of them knew where it would lead. For the first time, Maria felt a spark of hope, something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she felt like she was no longer invisible. She was someone who mattered, someone who had a place in this world beyond the shadows. And for the first time, she was ready to step into the light, whatever that might mean. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of uncertainty for both Maria and Dominic. The tension between them was still palpable, yet it had shifted into something different, something unspoken but undeniable. The mansion felt quieter, as if the weight of their conversations hung in the air, drifting between them like an invisible force. Maria continued with her duties, just as she always had, but she couldn't ignore the subtle changes that had started to affect the way she moved through the house. Every time she crossed paths with Dominic, her pulse quickened. He had never been one to engage with her outside of the boundaries of his expectations, but now, there were moments when he would simply stop and look at her, moments that made her heart race and her mind whirl with confusion. It wasn't that he had said anything outright to change things. It was more in the way he seemed to see her, as if the walls that had once kept them worlds apart were beginning to crack. Dominic, on the other hand, found himself in a similar position. He had never allowed himself to get too close to anyone, especially not someone like Maria. His life had always been about control, about keeping people at arm's length. But now, he couldn't help but feel that his once clear boundaries were beginning to blur. Maria was no longer just the maid in his eyes. She had become something more, and that scared him. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He was the Mafia boss, a man who had seen everything, done everything. He wasn't supposed to be moved by a woman who had simply done her job. Yet here he was, thinking about her more than he had ever expected to. It was a feeling he couldn't quite shake, no matter how hard he tried. It was late one evening when Dominic found himself standing outside Maria's room once again. He had walked past her quarters many times before, but tonight, something was different. He could feel the pull to speak with her, to figure out what was happening between them, even if he couldn't fully understand it. He knocked lightly on her door, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for her response. Yes. Maria's voice came from inside, and he could hear the calmness in her tone, though he knew she must be wondering why he was here. He took a deep breath before speaking. Maria, may I come in? There was a slight pause before she answered. Of course, sir. As the door opened, he saw her standing in the dim light, her figure outlined by the soft glow from the hallway. She looked at him with that familiar, guarded expression, but there was something new in her eyes, something that made him feel vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. I've been thinking about our conversation, Dominic said, stepping inside the room. Maria's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. About what happened after the fire, he added quietly. Maria nodded slowly, not knowing exactly where this conversation would go. I've been thinking about it too, she replied, her voice soft but steady. Dominic walked closer, his presence filling the space between them. He could feel the weight of the words he was about to say, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was ready to speak them. But he had to. You've changed something in me, Maria, he said, his voice quieter now. And I can't ignore it. Maria looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic's expression softened, and for the first time, Maria saw the depth of his emotion. I've never treated anyone the way I've treated you, he said slowly. I've never allowed anyone to get this close. But with you, he stopped, his words trailing off, as if he couldn't find the right way to finish the thought. Maria's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, unsure of what to say. She had never expected Dominic to be so open, so vulnerable with her. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've never expected this from you. Dominic looked at her, his eyes searching hers for some sign of understanding. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. I just wanted you to know that I see you. Not as the maid, but as someone who matters. Someone who means something to me. The words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she felt completely overwhelmed. She had never thought of herself as someone who mattered to anyone, especially not someone like Dominic. But now, as she stood in front of him, she couldn't deny the truth in his words. She mattered. She mattered to him. I don't know what this means, Maria said quietly, but I want to find out. Dominic's eyes softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. I do too, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We'll figure it out together. In that moment, Maria realized that this was only the beginning of something new, something neither of them had anticipated, but something that could change everything. And as Dominic reached out to gently take her hand, Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to face it with him by her side. In the days that followed, Maria and Dominic navigated the subtle shift in their relationship, neither of them fully understanding the changes that had begun to unfold. They moved through the mansion in the same way they always had, but everything felt different now. The tension that had once been a constant undercurrent had evolved into something more complex, a delicate balance between them. Dominic found himself watching Maria more than he ever had before. He didn't know exactly when the change had begun, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time he passed her, his gaze lingered a little longer, and he wondered if she noticed. There was something about her now that made him feel differently, something he couldn't quite put into words. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone who had saved his son, someone whose strength and courage had changed his perspective. But it wasn't just her actions that had caught his attention. It was the quiet confidence she carried with her now. Maria, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. She had never thought much about her place in the world, not until Dominic had looked at her differently. She had always been invisible to him, a mere shadow in the background, doing her job and nothing more. But now, she was seen. For the first time, she felt like she mattered. And that scared her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this change, for the new version of herself that seemed to be emerging. She had always kept her head down, always played the role of the invisible maid. But now, things were different. And as much as she tried to push those thoughts away, she couldn't help but wonder what this meant for her future. It was late one evening when Dominic found himself in the garden, his mind racing with thoughts of Maria. He had spent the past few days thinking about what she had said, about how she was willing to see where this new dynamic between them would go. It wasn't like him to leave things open-ended, to allow uncertainty to linger. But with Maria, it felt different. He had no answers, no clear path forward. But he knew one thing. He needed to find out. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain, to feeling vulnerable. But with her, he felt both. He watched as she worked in the garden, her back to him as she carefully pruned the roses. The evening sun bathed the garden in a warm, golden light, and for a moment, Dominic found himself frozen, watching her in silence. She was so focused on her task, her movements graceful and precise, that she didn't notice him standing there. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Maria," he called softly, his voice carrying through the quiet evening air. She turned, surprised to see him there. Her face softened when she saw him, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other. "Sir?" she asked, her voice tentative, unsure of what he wanted. Dominic took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but quieter than usual, "about everything that's changed between us." Maria didn't say anything, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. "I know this is unexpected," he continued, "but I want to be honest with you. I don't want things to be complicated between us." Maria's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had been bracing herself for some form of distance, for the return of the cold, distant Dominic she had known for so long. But now, as she stood there in front of him, she saw something else. Something she hadn't expected. Something that made her feel both vulnerable and seen. "I don't know what this means," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happens next." Dominic's eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her. "I don't know either," he admitted. "But I do know that I want to figure it out. I want to see where this goes with you, Maria." Maria's breath caught in her throat at his words. It wasn't what she had expected, but it was what she needed to hear. She had been waiting for him to pull away, to go back to the way things were. But now, as she stood there in the garden with him, she realized that things could never go back to what they were before. "I want to see where it goes too," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Dominic smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made Maria's heart skip a beat. For the first time, she saw the man behind the Mafia boss, the man who had been hidden behind the walls he had built around himself. "Then let's find out together," he said, his voice full of determination. Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't just about the future. It was about the present, about the two of them standing here, in this moment, willing to take the next step together. She didn't know where this would lead, but she was ready to take that step. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. With Dominic by her side, she felt like anything was possible. And as they stood there, the evening sun casting a golden glow over them, Maria realized that she wasn't alone anymore. She was seen, she was valued, and for the first time, she was ready to step into a future she never thought possible. The days that followed Maria and Dominic's conversation felt like they were both walking on a tightrope, unsure of where their next step would lead. They had crossed a line, an invisible boundary that neither of them had expected to cross, and now they were left to navigate the uncertainty that came with it. Maria continued to carry out her duties, though with a quiet sense of awareness that hadn't been there before. Every time she passed Dominic in the hallways or found herself in his presence, there was an unspoken understanding between them. It was as though the air itself had shifted and everything felt different. Dominic, on the other hand, found himself restless. He had spent years keeping people at a distance, building walls around himself that no one could penetrate. But with Maria, things were different. The walls he had so carefully constructed seemed to crumble with every passing day. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about her, something that made him see her in a way he had never seen anyone before. It wasn't just her strength, or her courage, or the fact that she had saved his son. It was more than that. It was the way she made him feel like he wasn't the only one with power, the way she made him question his own role in the world. He had always been in control, always been the one who called the shots. But with her, he found himself wanting to let go, to be something more than just the Mafia boss. He found himself wanting to be a man who could feel vulnerable, who could feel like he mattered beyond the empire he had built. One evening, after dinner, Dominic found himself walking through the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of Maria and everything that had changed between them. He had tried to ignore it, to push the feelings aside, but they kept creeping back, pulling him toward her. As he rounded a corner, he saw her standing by the window in the sitting room, her figure silhouetted by the soft glow of the moonlight. She was gazing out at the garden, lost in thought, and for a moment, Dominic just watched her. There was something about her presence that made everything feel still, as though the world around them had paused for just a moment. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this drawn to someone, this captivated by their mere existence. He cleared his throat, and Maria turned to face him. There was a moment of silence between them, an unspoken understanding that passed in the air, and then Dominic spoke. "Maria," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with something else, something deeper. "Can we talk?" Maria nodded, her expression unreadable, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm, yet there was an undercurrent of curiosity in it. Dominic stepped into the room, and they both stood there for a moment, not knowing where to begin. The space between them felt charged, as though everything they had shared so far had led to this moment. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "About us, and about where we go from here." Maria looked at him, her gaze steady, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I don't want to keep pretending," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I don't want to keep treating you like you're just the maid. Because you're not. You're so much more than that." Maria's heart skipped a beat at his words, and she felt a wave of emotion rush over her. She had never expected this, never imagined that he would see her this way. She had always been just a servant in his world, and the idea of being anything more seemed impossible. "I don't know what this means," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what to do with it." Dominic took a step closer, closing the distance between them, but not in a way that felt overbearing. His presence was still strong, but there was a softness to it now, something that made Maria feel like she could breathe again. "I don't know either," he admitted, his voice low, "but I know that I want to find out. I want to explore this, to see where it takes us. I want to be with you, not just as the Mafia boss and the maid, but as two people who are more than just their roles." Maria felt her chest tighten at his words. For a moment, she felt like she was going to crumble under the weight of it all. This was more than she had ever expected from him, more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. She had spent so long in the shadows, in the background, never daring to think that someone like Dominic would see her. But here he was, standing in front of her, offering something that felt real, something that felt like it could change everything. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I never thought I would be in this position," she said, her voice stronger now. "I never thought I would matter to someone like you." Dominic reached out, his hand gently resting on hers, grounding her in the moment. "You do matter to me," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I need you to understand that. You're not just the maid. You're Maria, and you've changed everything for me." Maria looked at him, her heart racing, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like she was just a background character in someone else's story. She was the lead in her own, and for the first time, she was ready to take that step forward. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice steady with newfound confidence. "I'm ready to see where this goes, with you." Dominic smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made Maria's heart flutter. "Then let's take that step together," he said, his voice filled with warmth and hope. And in that moment, Maria realized that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a maid in the shadows of someone else's life. She was the woman who had captured the heart of a man who had never thought he would be moved, and together, they would walk into a future neither of them had expected. As the days turned into weeks, Maria found herself adjusting to the subtle changes in her life. The distance that had once existed between her and Dominic had all but disappeared, but it was replaced by something even more unfamiliar. It was as though they were both walking a fine line between what had been and what could be, uncertain but willing to explore it. The tension that lingered between them was no longer something to be avoided. It was something they both silently acknowledged. In the quiet of the mansion, where the staff moved like shadows, Maria felt the weight of her new reality. She wasn't just the maid anymore. And neither was Dominic, just the Mafia boss. They had somehow crossed into new territory, together. It was in the small moments that she began to notice the shift. There were the casual conversations they had while walking through the halls, the way he would now pause to ask about her day or how she was feeling. There was an ease between them now that hadn't existed before, and though it was still fragile, Maria felt like she was slowly becoming a part of his world, something she had never allowed herself to believe before. It wasn't just about their moments together, though. Maria had begun to see him in a new light. Dominic, the powerful man who had once intimidated her, now seemed human in ways she hadn't expected. The walls he had built around himself, the barriers he had maintained for so long, were starting to come down. She saw glimpses of the man behind the hardened exterior, someone who was more than just the Mafia boss. And that realization stirred something in her that she wasn't sure how to handle. One evening, after dinner, Dominic invited Maria to join him in his study. It was a rare occurrence, and at first, Maria wasn't sure how to react. She had never been asked to sit with him in this setting before. The study, with its dark wood furniture and vast collection of books, always felt like a place of power, his domain. She had always been an outsider to it, but tonight, she was invited in. When she entered, Dominic was standing by the window, looking out over the grounds. He turned as he heard her footsteps, his gaze softening when he saw her, fixed on hers, about wanting to see where this goes. Maria's breath caught slightly. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again so soon, and she wasn't sure what to say. "I meant it," she replied softly, her voice steady. "I'm willing to see where this goes, but I don't know what that means yet." Dominic leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know either," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I want to find out with you. I want to take this one step at a time." Maria's heart raced, and for the first time, she realized how much she had been holding back. She had spent so much of her life hiding, trying to remain unnoticed, but now, with Dominic sitting in front of her, she realized that she had been given the opportunity to step into the light. She didn't have to hide anymore. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what it means to change, to be more than just what I've always been." Dominic's expression softened, and he reached across the desk, his hand resting gently on hers. "I'm scared too," he said quietly, "but I'm not asking you to do this alone. I'll be right here, with you, every step of the way." Maria looked down at his hand on hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. She had never felt this way before, seen, understood, and cared for in ways she never imagined possible. For so long, she had kept her distance from others, afraid to let anyone in, but now, with Dominic, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. "I don't know where this will lead," she said, her voice steady now, "but I'm willing to take that first step, with you." Dominic smiled, a small but genuine smile that made something in Maria's chest swell with emotion. "Then let's take it together," he said softly. And in that moment, Maria knew that no matter what the future held, she wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who saw her, someone who understood her, and someone who was willing to walk with her into whatever came next. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chapter they would write together, hand in hand, not as employer and servant, but as equals, ready to face the unknown. The walls between them were gone, and all that remained was the open path ahead, full of possibility. The weeks that followed were a quiet evolution for both Maria and Dominic. There was still a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air, but it was no longer the kind of uncertainty that left them paralyzed. It was the kind that invited exploration, the kind that made them both wonder what the future might hold. Dominic, for the first time in a long while, felt something he hadn't expected. His world, built on control and power, had always been a place of distance. But with Maria, that distance seemed to fade with every passing day. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was someone he relied on, someone whose presence had become as necessary as the air he breathed. Maria, too, had begun to realize that things had changed. She had never allowed herself to think about her future in terms of someone who mattered. She had been content with the role she had played in the background, never questioning her place. But now, as she went about her days, she couldn't help but notice the way Dominic looked at her, the way his actions spoke louder than his words. He had made it clear that he saw her as more than just someone who worked for him, but she still wasn't sure what that meant for her. Could she really allow herself to believe it? Could she really see herself as more than just a servant? One evening, after a long day of work, Maria found herself in the quiet of the mansion, walking through the halls, lost in thought. She had never been one for idle conversation, and she had learned long ago to find solace in her own company. But tonight, something was different. There was a pull in the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite shake. As she passed by the study, she saw the door was slightly ajar. She had almost kept walking, but then she saw Dominic standing by the window, looking out over the estate. He turned as he heard her footsteps, and for a moment, they just stood there, the space between them filled with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. "Maria," Dominic said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Come in." Maria hesitated. For a moment before stepping into the room. She had been in this room countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. The dim light, the scent of leather-bound books, and the quiet hum of the house outside all seemed to intensify the moment. She wasn't sure why, but she felt like this conversation would change everything. "I've been thinking," Dominic began, his tone softer than usual, "about what we talked about the other day." Maria didn't speak, her heart beating faster as she waited for him to continue. He stepped toward her, his expression more serious than she had seen in a long time. "I don't want us to go back to the way things were," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't want to pretend that nothing has changed, because it has." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had been afraid of this moment, afraid that the things they had begun to explore would fall apart, that it would all go back to being nothing more than a fleeting moment. But Dominic's next words shattered that fear. "I want you to know that I'm not just saying this because of what happened with the fire," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm saying this because I've come to realize something important, something that goes beyond our roles in this house. I want you in my life, Maria, not just as someone who works here, but as someone who matters to me." Maria stood there, frozen in the moment. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't find the words. This wasn't what she had expected. She had never allowed herself to hope for something more than what she was. But now, Dominic was giving her something she didn't know how to handle, a chance to be more, to be seen as someone of value. "I don't know what this means," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this." Dominic took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming yet reassuring. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "You just have to be here, with me." For a moment, Maria thought she might crumble under the weight of his words. She had always thought of herself as unimportant, as someone who had no place in the world outside of the mansion's walls. But now, with Dominic standing before her, offering her a place beside him, she felt like everything she had known was being turned upside down. "I never thought I could be something more," Maria said, her voice trembling. "I never thought I could be someone who mattered to anyone." Dominic's hand reached out, gently cupping her face, and for the first time, Maria allowed herself to feel the warmth of his touch. "You matter to me," he said simply, his voice full of sincerity. "You've always mattered. You just didn't see it." Maria felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the time for something new. "I'm willing to try," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm willing to see where this goes. With you." Dominic smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made her heart flutter. "Then let's take it one step at a time," he said. "Together." And in that moment, Maria knew that she wasn't just stepping into a new chapter of her life. She was stepping into a new world, one where she was no longer invisible, where she mattered. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she was ready to face it, not as the maid in the background, but as someone who had earned her place beside the man who had once been nothing more than a distant figure in her life. Together, they would write a new story, and this time, Maria would be at the center of it. As the weeks passed, Maria and Dominic settled into a routine that was both comfortable and uncertain. The shift between them was not one of grand declarations, but subtle moments that spoke louder than words ever could. The tension they had once felt had transformed into something that allowed them to exist in the same space, without the weight of expectation. There were still moments of doubt, moments when they both questioned what this meant for them. But they had come to understand that the future didn't need to be decided all at once. It could unfold slowly, one step at a time. For Maria, the most difficult part was learning to see herself differently. She had spent so many years in the shadows, never allowing herself to believe that she mattered, that she could be more than the role she had played for so long. But now, with Dominic by her side, those walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to shrink in the background. She was someone who mattered, someone who had earned a place in his world. The realization wasn't easy to accept, but it was liberating. Dominic, on the other hand, found himself grappling with the unexpected shift in his own life. The man who had built his empire on control and power, who had never allowed anyone to get too close, now found himself more vulnerable than he had ever been. He didn't mind it, though. The vulnerability that had once scared him now felt like a bridge between him and Maria. She had changed everything for him, and he was no longer afraid to embrace that change. One afternoon, Dominic and Maria found themselves in the garden, surrounded by the beauty of the blooming flowers and the quiet hum of the mansion's surroundings. It had become their place, a space where they could talk without the pressures of their roles weighing down on them. They were just two people, learning about each other, learning what it meant to exist together outside of the walls of the mansion. As Maria knelt to tend to the roses, Dominic watched her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't quite describe. She was so different from the woman who had first arrived at his home. She had always been strong, always been capable, but now she carried herself with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. He had seen her grow, seen her step into her own, and it made him feel something deep within himself: pride, admiration, and, above all, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Maria," he said, his voice soft as he approached her. She turned to face him, wiping a smear of dirt from her hands. There was a small smile on her lips, one that made him feel as though the world had slowed down for just a moment. "Yes?" she asked, her eyes warm as they met his. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. "I've been thinking about how far we've come," he began, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "How much you've changed my life." Maria looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected him to say something like that, and it made the air between them feel charged. She took a step closer, unsure of what to say next. "I never thought I'd be in this place," he continued, his gaze steady on her. "I never thought I could be this vulnerable, this open, but you've made me see things differently." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Dominic as a man of few words, a man who kept his emotions hidden beneath layers of control. But now, standing in front of her, he was saying things that she hadn't expected from him. It was both humbling and terrifying. "I've never been this honest with anyone," he admitted, his voice quiet. "Not even with myself." Maria didn't know how to respond to that. She had never imagined that Dominic, the powerful and untouchable man she had known, would open up to her in this way. It made her feel seen, in a way she had never experienced before. It wasn't just that he was acknowledging her. It was that he was acknowledging himself in a way he never had before. "I never thought I could be the kind of person who needed someone," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But now I realize I need you. I don't want to let go of what we have." Maria's heart swelled with emotion, and she took a step closer to him. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that, in this moment, they were building something real, something that was beyond just a simple connection. It was more than that. "I don't want to let go either," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything they had been through. "I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I want to move forward with you, Dominic." His eyes softened, and he reached for her hand, taking it gently in his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as though the world had stopped spinning for just a moment, allowing them to exist in a space that was entirely their own. "Then let's move forward," Dominic said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Together." And as Maria stood there, holding his hand, she realized that this was it. This was the moment when everything had changed. They weren't just two people learning to navigate the complexities of their relationship. They were two people who had stepped into the light, who had learned to embrace their vulnerability, and who were finally allowing themselves to be seen. Maria wasn't the maid anymore, and Dominic wasn't just the Mafia boss. They were both something more. They were a team, ready to face whatever the future had in store for them, together.